the history of San Antonio, Bexar County area, there has not really been much landscaping. The joke is that the San Antonio, Bexar County area is in a constant state of drought, interrupted by an occasional deluge. So we don't have a whole lot of water around here, and landscaping is really for the well-to-do. Most folks, the only landscaping they had would have been plants that they would have used for eating. The primary sources of water in the San Antonio area were downtown, the San Antonio River, the San Pedro Springs, those areas. Out here where I live in northwest San Antonio, there were no sources of water. And so landscaping was really pretty sparse, and as I said, it was left to the wealthier who could afford to have plants and have the luxury of using water just for landscaping. That changed, though, in the 20th century. The 20th century, with the various world wars, there was a lot more movement of our population. We have Fort Sam Houston down here. We had Brooks Air Force Base, Kelly Air Force Base, Lackland Air Force Base, Camp Bullis, Randolph, and Camp Stanley. And so more and more people began to move here from various parts of the country, and that especially got to be significant after World War II, when people were moving all over the place. People were moving where the jobs were. But after World War II, they started to close the bases up north, and they began to consolidate the bases, and San Antonio was a very strong military hub. In fact, it's called Military City today. When people moved down here, they tried to recreate home. If you were from Indiana, you tried to recreate Indiana, recreate California, North Carolina. And so they may bring plants with them, or the nurseries would sell plants that they were looking for from home. The problem is, this isn't home. This is not California. This is not Indiana, Michigan. This is not North Carolina. This is Central Texas. Very limestone soil, very alkaline water, not a whole lot of rain. When we get it, we really get it. So there was this disconnect between what will grow here and what some of these people wanted to grow here. Well, that bridge between what grows and what doesn't grow and landscaping began to be bridged back probably in the 70s, 80s, maybe as early as the 60s, with some significant people. Pam Puryear, Greg Grant, Steve George, Bill Welsh. These were people, and there are others, but these were people who went and found plants that grew here, that thrived here, and they began to propagate these plants, and they began to be sold in the San Antonio, Bexar County area as plants that would grow here. So those early pioneers are just exceptional. And I know I left some names out, and I apologize for that. But these people were the ones who made horticulture what it is today. One of the early pioneers in this movement was a guy named Mike Shupe. Mike Shupe is the owner of the Antique Rose Emporium. The mailing address says Brenham, Texas, but it's really right on the outskirts of Independence, and it's the original Baylor University location. So right literally on the outskirts of Independence, Texas, is one of the finest nurseries you're going to find. I had a chance to visit Mike Shupe a year or so ago, and I couldn't find that video, and I finally came across it. So this is a great story. This is one of the pioneers in finding and growing plants that not only survive here, but thrive here. So in his own words, the owner of the Antique Rose Emporium, Mike Shupe.
I mean, this is a kind of an interesting place. I'm really, excited to kind of show it off. We've developed this business over the last 40 years, and it's been really a business of struggle. I look back and I realized that when I first started, I was just interested in creating a place where people could buy landscape plants. And so we started by growing a lot of the ordinary landscape plants that were available at the time, and they would be the Photinia, the Asiatic jasmine, and the ligustrum. And it was a fairly easy process of taking the cuttings of these plants and potting them up into 1, 2, and 5 gallon pots and offering them to landscapers. And that was very, very successful back in the mid 70s. But the early 80s came around, and we had found ourselves in the midst of a recession here in Texas, and the sales were not easy. And the banks were calling our note. But luckily, I became involved with an organization that was led by Lynn Lowry, and he and Carol Abbott were instrumental in going into the wilds of Texas to bring back the native plants that evolved here in Texas, and offering them to the public in the spirit that they could be a better adapted plant than the exotics that we were planting, the ligustrums and photinias and such. So this is something I just completely embraced, and it was the most fun that we've ever had, is going on these forays out into the wilds of Texas and in Mexico and different places. And if you knew Lynn, you knew that you had to be a tough guy, because you seldom got water or something to eat. He was so passionate about what he found out in the wilds. And so as we started finding the stuff, I came across, in many cases, or we came across plants that were not necessarily native in abandoned home sites and in cemeteries, which really are wonderful, fruitful grounds to finding what once was popular amongst the homeowners, because they would plant in honor of the deceased their favorite plant, which in many cases was a rose or an iris or a daylily or a crepe myrtle. So it was fascinating to be able to talk to Lynn and see the discoveries. But what really struck me was that I was finding roses in some of these places. We found roses by these headstones that dated back into the 1800s. And I said, I thought roses were these plants that required all these fussy spray schedules and all these pruning regiments, and they were difficult to grow. And that was my experience with them. I didn't want to have anything to do with roses. And yet here we were finding roses surviving on their own without any care from man's hands, living there for years. And it was kind of like Mother Nature had done her work for us, giving us the strong. The ones that haven't survived, obviously we weren't going to be privy to, so we didn't come across any of those. We obviously, because they were dead or gone. But we did find a lot of these survivors, and we took cuttings back, and they grew and flourished and bloomed and had fragrance and were this and that. And I said, these plants could be good garden plants for the modern homeowners. And so that started the Antique Rose Emporium, is collections of these wild and lost and forgotten roses growing in cemeteries. And I love what the Texas Rose Rustlers, which is a group I became involved with later, coined. They say, if dead people can grow them, then anybody can. And that was the spirit of what we were finding. We were finding the tried and true, the time-tested varieties that Mother Nature didn't kill. In other words, what Mother Nature allowed, or what plants were strong enough to endure Mother Nature. And so they were the best of the best. And so cuttings of these plants flourished in our nursery. We started chronicling what we had. In many cases, these roses, we didn't know what they were, so we'd give them found rose names. We'd give them names like Old Gay Hill Red Cemetery, China, because we found it in a cemetery in Old Gay Hill. Or San Marcos Red, because we found it in a cemetery in San Marcos. Or Highway 290 Pink Buttons, because we found it off of Highway 290 and didn't have any idea what it was. But as we collected these things, the names really didn't matter, because we knew they were tough roses that needed to be brought back and introduced into our modern landscape industry, or garden industry. And as we did collect and we got more and more collections, names did start to occur. We realized that this old catalog had a picture of a rose called Louis Philippe, and we had a cutting of a rose that looked exactly like it. And as we read about this rose, we realized that this rose was introduced into Texas in the mid-1800s by Lorenzo de Zavala, who was a minister to France when Texas was a republic. So it was a gift to him from the French back in that time period. And here this rose was surviving here in this mid-Texas cemetery, Central Texas Cemetery. And so the stories that started evolving are coming to light from the collection of these plants just really excited us as far as the potential of these plants. So we became heavily involved in roses, something I swore I'd have nothing to do with when I got my master's degree at Texas A&M in horticulture. I swore I would have nothing to do with roses, and yet here I am, probably one of the biggest advocates of old roses there is, because we want these roses to have a place in our gardens because they deserve to, and because they are so rewarding to the gardener. They live despite all the difficulties that Texas can give them, the blue northers, the droughts. These roses are survivors, and so they are wonderful as plants in our Texas landscapes. And they offer two things that many of our modern roses can't provide. Modern roses were bred because of their strong, high-centered, perfectly formed flowers that are used for best of show in our garden shows. But these old roses have characteristics that were born before these old roses became hybridized. And in trying to keep this perfection of the rose, the breeders bred out all the good characteristics that were inherent in many of these old roses. Two of those characteristics I want to speak about, and one of them is fragrance. The fragrance that you get from some of these old roses is so powerful and so important, I feel, to what these roses give to you. They're like an emotion, they're like a memory, and they are extremely important. To smell a rose and not have it have any fragrance, you might as well be looking at a picture of a rose in a book. There's nothing that ties you to the flower. But a fragrant plant, like many of these old roses have, are extremely thought-provoking, and they create an emotion. And I think that's so important with flowers, especially with roses. And so many of these old roses have this nuance of fragrance, and it's not just one fragrance, it's a multitude, each one smelling differently, almost like each one having its own identity. Some of them banana cream pie, some of them citrus, some of them true damask fragrance. They're all very, very different, but therein lies the beauty of that infinite characteristic. The other part of the old rose that is so captivating for the landscaper is the fact that they're very diverse in their form. They all have different characteristics. If you were to put these roses in a rose garden, you would be perplexed by the array of shapes and sizes. They wouldn't work in these rectangular prisons that we call rose gardens. These roses are infinite in the way that they grow. They have different embodiments of structure, of leaf size, of when they bloom, of size and stature. And so they beg you, the gardener, to use them in many ways in the landscape. And as a result, then you become more creative. Roses don't belong in a rose garden. They belong in a garden that has roses in them. And it's a very big difference. As you look around here, no roses are in a rectangular bed. They're with other plants. They ebb and flow with the natural beauty through the seasons of all other plants, and that makes them not a burden. They ebb and flow just like every other plant, and so they're much more rewarding that way. To embellish the architecture of your home or your fence line, to plant with other plants, mixtures, they almost beg you, the garden artist, to use them in different ways by the way that they grow. They have a diversity of form that is wonderful for landscaping with. So those two qualities, fragrance and diversity of form, make old roses the true and ultimate garden plant, and they can replace almost any other plant. The only requirements that roses love are lots of sun. And if we have lots of sun here in Texas, which I know we do, then they're the plant of choice. And as you walk around these gardens, you'll see how we've used these roses to embellish that particular aspect of their beauty. The favorite old rose that I found was the one that set me onto the course of history of me growing these roses. A mermaid growing on a fence row in a pasture out in a remote area near Marble Falls. And I was not with, I was with Tommy Adams, who was my propagator at the time, and he was the one that noticed the rose, and we went back, and that's where we got cuttings from this rose. It was a rose that was growing along a fence line. It had these big giant flowers that looked like fried eggs, And I said, what is that? And we stopped and looked at it, and we looked at the thorns and the foliage. This is a rose, and it's growing all by itself here. And so that was the epiphany, where everything else changed, and all of a sudden I became aware that there are roses out there that are surviving on their own without this stigma of having perpetual care that I thought roses needed to have. And from that point on, we found roses growing in lots of different places. Cemeteries are wonderful places, especially the smaller ethnic communities or the poorer communities where they don't keep up with weed eating everything and keeping everything perfect. If you can go into some of those places, you will find what was once admired by these pioneers or these earlier homesteads, where they would pass along plants, be successful with plants. Their favorites would be a rose or an iris or a daylily or even a crepe myrtle or a camellia. But you would find those plants there still surviving if they were durable enough. And that's the throwback into time to tell you which plants were best for this particular area, because they're still there. We continue to get calls from people whose grandmother is dying and she has a rose. They don't know what it is, but they want to save it because of her. And they'll send us pictures and we'll try to identify it. But we are always hopeful we don't know what it is, because that's another rose that is saved and rescued if we can take cuttings and move it, take cuttings and protect it, clone it, so that there's more than that one rose still surviving. But as I became involved with this, yes, we would go out into the countryside. I became involved with a very loosely organized group of Texas rose rustlers, who is headed by Pam Purrier, a historian and a beautiful lady that lived in Navasota. And she was a tremendously brilliant historian. And she knew a lot of the history of all these pioneer ladies and women of the past. And she knew of all these roses being passed from the pioneers as they moved westward. And so she had chronicled a lot of the roses that she thought she would be finding, and indeed did in some of these cemeteries. She became involved with Joe Woodard and Bill Welch, some of the principal players in these early rose rustlers. And we were tagged along and took cuttings and started the Antique Rose Emporium from a lot of the successes of a lot of these individuals going out on their own and collecting their own roses. And our first catalog was full of nothing but roses with found rose names. Names like Highway 290 Pink Buttons, or Ogay Hill Red China, or San Marcos Red. I mean, I mentioned to those earlier. These are roses that we just simply gave them names so we could remember where we got those original cuttings. They turned out to be, looking at old catalogs and old literature, actually introduced varieties. San Marcos Red turned out to be Archduke Charles, an old China introduced in the 1800s. And so it confirmed our suspicion that these roses were really time-tested survivors from bygone times, still here and still yearning to be part of our landscape. And so we feel like we have been an instrument of bringing these roses forward and offering them in the spirit that they're tough yet beautiful plants from the past. Some of these roses date back, more than hundreds of years. Because they were introduced in those time periods. Autumn damask certainly is a very old rose, and there are certainly older ones. Old blush may be even earlier than the 1700s, when it was documented to be here in the States. So yes, these roses go way back in time. They could have been bred by an early Chinese mandarin who had a garden in China. And these roses, essentially, when China opened up her gates to man and moved some of these plants westward, we're seeing some of these plants established here in Texas based on some of those early pioneer movements.
If you have a question about this video specifically, please email me. My email address will be bcmg, that's Bexar County Master Gardener. It's a private email, but I use those initials, bcmg61 at yahoo.com. And please tell me specifically the video to which you are referencing. If you have gardening questions in general, really a great place to start is your County Master Gardener program, and you can find them on the internet. This is the contact information for the Bexar County Master Gardener Association. Here's our email address. here is our phone number. It's either a hotline or a helpline, depending on how much of an emergency it is or how bad your crisis is. If it's a crisis, it's a hotline. If it's not a crisis, you just have general question, it'll consider it a helpline. In Bexar County, we also have a Facebook page, and you are invited to become part of it and interact on our Facebook page. So I hope this video was helpful, and I'll see you at the next one.